Welcome back to the Shine Within podcast. Ann Latham, acclaimed as the Queen of Clarity, is the author of The Disconnect Principle and the Power of Clarity. She founded the consulting firm Uncommon Clarity, which serves as a diverse range of clients, including Boeing and PBS. Her insights have been featured in the New York Times, Bloomberg, and she is a Forbes.com expert blogger. Ann is also known for her dynamic speaking engagements and has lectured at the University of Massachusetts Eisenberg School of Management. She proudly holds the unique corporate accolade of most likely to dispute recognized authorities. We're just talking about messing up with speaking, and then there I'm trying to read something and oh, thank you so much, Anne, for being on my show today. I'm excited about our conversation and talking about your new book.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited too.
Yeah. So, Anne, can you go ahead and explain what led you to the creation of the disconnect principle and how it aims to transform traditional feedback and performance management?
Right. So I was working with a client that I will call Max, and we were working on a project, but he called me one day because he was struggling with giving feedback to a difficult employee. So I sat down with him and I taught him everything I'd ever learned about giving feedback and being sure that he was focused on a very specific event and that he wasn't dragging in past, conversations and incidents, and that he was able to explain exactly what the guy did and what the impact of that behavior was so that he could be specific and clear and the employee would understand. And after going through, talking about words he should use and words he should avoid and how to set up the whole conversation, he was so ready to go in there and have this conversation. And when I talked to him afterwards, he was so dejected because it had gone miserably as usual. And that's when I had an epiphany and realized what was missing from all the advice we've been given on giving constructive feedback. And what I realized is that all that advice is about what to say, but not what to think. So this guy went into this meeting with a script. He was prepared to talk, but in his head, he had these judgmental thoughts. He was mad at the guy. He was determined to either fix him or fire him. And there was no way that the employee couldn't see what was really going on in this guy's head. His facial expressions and his tone of voice and his body language gave away his thoughts. So the employee wasn't going to be fooled at all. And what I realized is that Max had to take care of his thoughts. He could not go in there thinking the way he thought, or he wasn't going to have a civil conversation. It wasn't going to work.
I know, right?
So that's when I came up with the disconnect principle, which goes like this. When something doesn't go as you expected, all you know for certain is something didn't go as you expected. And you don't know much more than that. But we leap to conclusions and decide that, oh, he was bad, he's troubled, he's careless, he's thoughtless, he's whatever. We tend to blame people and judge them instead of going, wait a minute, where do things really stand? And so the best response in that case is to say, I think we have a disconnect. And so when you say that, you level the playing field, you open the door for a conversation, there's no judgment in that, and you just step back and say, so where are we and what do we need to do next?
Right. I wish I can then share that with my husband. I think we have a disconnect because so oftentimes we're just pointing the finger, but then there's two pointing right back at us. It's like, or three.
Right. And we do it so quickly, and disconnects happen all the time. We're disappointed by little things, when someone doesn't show up on time, or when someone lets us down, or when an employee screws up, or when a friend does something that we think is unkind or whatever, or your partner who lets you down somehow. And then, but instead of judging them or getting mad, you go, wait a minute, we've got a disconnect. Let's figure out what just happened. Where are we? What do we need to do next? How can we fix this? And then you learn from each other. You find out what they were thinking. They weren't necessarily being careless and thoughtless. Something might have come up. They might have had a different idea of how to do something. And there's so many possibilities. And we tend to just leap to conclusions.
Right. One of my mentors told me, if you assume something, you're wrong, even though if your assumption's right, you're still wrong because we're assuming. And it's always good to get clarity. I always love the word clarity. I often talk about it in my podcast too. Just to be clear of like, hey, by the way, do you mean this? Just to get clarity. And
Right.
so often once you feel acknowledged, then the conversation becomes fluid and you guys kind of understand each other a little bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as
Yes.
long as you're not harboring these negative thoughts, you can have an open, honest, constructive conversation.
Right. Now, in your book, you discuss how carefully prepared scripts often fail us in critical moments. Could you share an example from your consulting experience that illustrates this problem?
Well, Max was the perfect example because he did have a carefully prepared script. He knew exactly what he wanted to say. He had a specific event. He was talking about the observable behavior. He was totally prepared. And it failed because he failed before he even opened his mouth, before he said anything. But even if you start talking and explaining things and you're doing pretty well, staying on script, and your impromptu words, if the employee reacts in a way you didn't expect, you'll likely say something off script that reveals those true feelings. So you have to take care of your thoughts first.
Yes. And how does the disconnect principle help leaders avoid slipping into a boss persona that might not fit them well? And what are the impacts of the shift on team dynamics?
Yeah, well, if you remember the principle itself, which is if something doesn't happen as you expected, all you know for certain is something didn't happen as you expected. That helps you step back. So that would help any leader step back and go, wait a minute, I have to stop here and just say, I think we have a disconnect. And it makes all the difference in the world. I have clients who have embraced the disconnect principle. They bought copies of the book, The Disconnect Principle, for all their employees. And it has totally changed their culture because everyone understands and they know what a disconnect is and they call them out when they happen. So I think we have a disconnect. We definitely have a disconnect. And instead of getting mad at someone, they just say, wait a minute, we have a disconnect. And then they stop and then they're focused on the situation, not the person. So they're working together to solve problems instead of judging each other and ending up in, difficult conversations. So it's totally changed the culture of those organizations because people are just working out disconnects all the time and not ever getting to big problems and judging each other.
Right. I remember many disconnects in the work environment before, and before I understood how to communicate better, I would always go to assumptions before, and then there would never be a solution. We're just arguing who's right, who's wrong, who's right, who's wrong, who's right, who's wrong, and nothing would get solved. And so I love your principle because then you're pausing for a moment and asking that question, and then figuring out, okay, what can we do now that we know we both have a disconnect?
Yeah. So let's fix the situation. Let's not try to fix each other. Let's not try
Right.
to convert each other. Let's not try to convince each other. Just say, this is where we're at. Agree on where you're at and what you need to do to make things better. And it doesn't matter what, if someone just annoys you because they're constantly late, you say, look, we have a disconnect. I was raised to always show up on time and I always show up on time. And it really bugs me when you're always late because you waste my time. So how are we going to solve this problem? You tend to come late. So should we maybe set the time for 1 o'clock, but you put it on your calendar as 12:30? I mean, how can we solve this problem so it doesn't keep happening? So you're not blaming the person, you're just saying, how are we going to work together so this doesn't always happen?
And I'm sure that reduces the workplace anxiety, right? Because
Yeah,
there's less tension. And you also,
absolutely.
yeah, and you mentioned guarding our facial expressions and body language to mask feelings like anxiety and doubt. Now, how does your approach help, I guess, managers be more genuine without compromising their leadership?
Yeah, the toughest thing there is that you literally have to get those negative thoughts out of your head because you can't mask them. I mean, at least I can't. I can't pretend if I'm mad at someone, no matter how hard I try to pretend I'm not mad at someone, it's going to come through, you
Right,
know.
right,
I'm not going to be the same relaxed, smiling person that I would be in another situation. But if you can say, wait a minute, we have a disconnect, and you focus on the disconnect, not the person, then you're problem solving and you're pointed at that disconnect. And it's easier to take those negative thoughts out of your head and not to, get mad and start judging people. So you just say, whoa, stop. We have a disconnect. Let's figure out where we are and what we need to do next. And then you can a lot of times even laugh about the disconnect because sometimes if you can be that objective, you can laugh about the situation, you can smile about it, you can talk honestly about it. So you're not hiding your feelings.
right. I'm thinking about my husband right now, and he was working at a startup company before. And his managers were very harsh. Do this, do that, do this. Da, da." And now, I mean, he's no longer at that company for obvious reasons. He's working for another company where his manager's a little bit too loosey-goosey, lenient, and just like, "Ah." So I know many managers actually struggle with being perceived as either too harsh or too lenient. How does your principle guide them to maintain empathy while being effective?
Yeah, that's a good question. But the more you can think in terms of the disconnects instead of the person, then you're working on specific situations time and time again and not beating up a person, not building a case against a person. I think if you even begin to wonder if you're being unfair, you're probably trying to do something to somebody. You're trying to fix them, you're trying to correct them, you're trying to change them. And you shouldn't be focused on the person. So take the most difficult case of all when you have a manager who thinks they need to fire an employee, and that's usually an awful situation. Usually the manager either decides, well, I got to be, firm, I got to be tough, I got to, tough love, whatever. And they usually put that boss persona on to effectively fire someone. And the person who's getting fired never is happy, it's always they're defensive, they are scared, they're embarrassed, whatever. There's always strong emotions involved in those cases. But if everyone understands the disconnect principle, then if someone is constantly in a situation where the boss is repeatedly unhappy, you just like, if you could step this back and say, using the disconnect principle, you would just identify each disconnect and work on each disconnect as it happened and fix each of those problems. And if there are too many disconnects happening too quickly, then there's a bigger disconnect. And that is that what the boss needs or what the company needs is not a good fit for what the employee is willing and able to provide. And so there's a mismatch here, and that's the disconnect. So it's not about the person being a failure or that the person is a bad person, or it's just you've got a bad match. But the more people think in terms of disconnects, they can realize that it's time to part ways. Unless you can work together and figure out how to make the match work. Can we change your responsibilities? Can we change the way the disconnect in how we work together? Can we change things so that you're doing more of the things you like? If you could make that match between the employee and the position stronger, then maybe you can work together and everything can be fixed. Otherwise, it's like quit, it's time to part ways, but it doesn't mean that the employee is to blame or should feel like they're failing. It's just like, I guess we can't make this work out. It's a partnership that's not working, so we have to go our separate ways.
Right. Reminds me of a lot of past relationships back in
Yes.
them days. We just kind of
Yeah, and
part
even
ways.
with relationships, it's like, look, if we can't fix these disconnects so that we can, talk more honestly together, so that we can do things together without tension, maybe it's just time to part ways. And it's hard to boil this down into an example because relationships and the struggles of the relationships are so different from couple to couple. But it's not necessarily because someone's bad or has failed, or there should be no blame, no shame, no hard feelings. It's just like it's not working.
Yeah. And then you'll both be happier in the long run.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about replacing fear with action. What are some practical steps a manager can actually take to replace fear and avoidance with timely, confident action as suggested in your book?
Whoa, did I suggest that? Well, I'm sure it's there somewhere, but well, yeah, if you people, well, maybe we should get specific. Give me an example of someone who's fearful, they're afraid of losing their job.
Yeah,
Let's take that one. So that
that
gets
one's good.
back to a little bit what I was already talking about. If things you're afraid of losing your job or something because something you're having, there's tension, there's something going on, things are not working the way you should. So if you can stop and say, whoa, I think we have a disconnect. I just tried to do this. You don't seem to be happy with that. Help me understand what it is that I should have done or I could have done so that we can work this out. If a boss gives you a, a task and you already have too much to do, you can say, I think we have a disconnect. I'm working as hard as I can to finish this project you gave me, and now you just gave me something else. I don't think I can get them both done. Let's talk about priorities. What do you really need me to do first? Help me figure this out. So you have to be willing to, lay it on the table and say, I think we have a disconnect. You help me make this work. And then if you have a boss who just says, no, that's your job, you figure it out, get them both done, then you really should go somewhere else. Because why do you want to work there?
I know. I often talk to so many women, and then they say, oh, I left my corporate company because it just wasn't aligned to their values and morals anymore. And they just wanted to move on because they're like, why suffer? Why
Yeah,
suffer? Move
yeah.
on if you don't like your boss. And it's just not working out that way, even though you've had tried to work things out and probably use your disconnect principle and it still didn't work. Then it's time to say, let bygones be bygones and just
And
go.
you can also give your boss a copy of my book, The Disconnect Principle, just slip it on
There
his
you
desk,
go. A wonderful a gift. What is it called?
Or if other people you're working with understand the disconnect principle, that's an important component. You can still use it all by yourself. You can say, look, we have a disconnect. I was thinking this way. You seem to be thinking differently. Let's work on this disconnect. You can do that even without anyone ever hearing about the disconnect principle. But if the people you're working with understand the disconnect principle, it's much easier because then they know exactly what you mean when you say, I think we have a disconnect.
100%. Now let's talk a little bit about building trust. How does avoiding judgmental conversations lead to better trust and collaboration within teams, would you say?
Well, I think it's kind of obvious. I mean, if you have difficult conversations, if you get into headbutting, it's hard to feel comfortable and respectful and fair and all those positive things that makes it easy to work with other people. And the easier it is and the better you can work with other people, then you have positive results, and that builds trust. If people treat you fairly, that builds trust. If you work together and things work, that builds trust. If you are show that you're reliable, that builds trust. And so if you constantly solve these disconnects, you constantly build a stronger relationship because you understand each other, you learn about each other, you learn how to work together, and you have more and more positive experiences. But of course, on the flip side, if you're constantly butting heads and you're not sure why people are doing what they're doing, that erodes trust.
Yes. Now, have you actually noticed any cultural shifts at all when it comes to the disconnect principle? Are people adopting to it and using it?
Yeah, yeah. And the clients who use it, the clients who I've worked with and taught it to, and they bought copies of the book for their employees, or they've listened to the audio version. Um, it has totally become a part of their culture. They are quick to say they see disconnects everywhere and they're quick to call them out. Whereas I worked with that organization before that happened, before I even invented the disconnect principle. And they were, talking behind each other's backs. They were saying that, this person's unreliable, and they were spreading that word. And there was the typical, not only just headbutting, but destroying each other relationships and reputations, because people just didn't always get along, and they didn't trust people to do their thing, and they didn't work well together. So it totally flipped their culture, because now they just go, I think we have a disconnect. And they didn't try to fix the person, they fix the disconnect. And when you try to fix people, it doesn't go over well. None of us like to be fixed, and we don't like to be corrected. We don't like to be coerced or manipulated. No, work with me, help me understand what you need, and let me help you understand what I need. Let's fix this situation and make things work out better.
Yes, yes. Now, anything happening for you in the future? Any initiatives or special projects? Any more talks? Anything
I
exciting?
I wrote the Power of Clarity, which is sort of well, not sort of, it is my legacy book. I am known for creating clarity, and when I wrote the Power of Clarity, it was to try to help anyone who reads it be able to create clarity the way I do, to learn what I do. So I packed everything in there. The disconnect principle was the little piece that wouldn't fit. So it required more than just a chapter in the book anyway. It required its own book. The funny thing is as I taught the disconnect principle, I learned all the things that were obstacles to people using it effectively. So that's why there's chapters 2 through 8 and not just one chapter or one article. So having done that, those are like my two main books. I've got a couple others out there, the Clarity Papers and Uncommon Meetings, but I'm no longer taking clients. So I write, I will continue to write, I will continue to try to get people to learn more about how to create clarity and how to use the disconnect principle. That's why I just did a TED Talk. And I just want to get those messages out there because I think they're really important. But I will continue writing. I don't know what the next book might be.
Yes, I'm going to have to buy some of your books to gift to my husband's company because
Yes,
they
there's
can
a
all
brilliant idea.
benefit from that.
That's right. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, where can our listeners go ahead and find you on social media, website, books? Where can they
Yeah, you
purchase
can
your books?
connect with me on LinkedIn. My name's Ann Latham, and I'm obvious on LinkedIn because if you look for Ann Latham, there's only one Queen of Clarity that'll
That's
show up
awesome.
next to my name. And my website, annlatham.com, has links to all my books and my TED Talk. And that's probably the easiest place to find everything right away.
Amazing. And any last words or thoughts you'd like to share?
You really take a little time to listen to my TED Talk. Um, like I say, if you go to annlatham.com, you can find it there. Share it with people. The more people who understand the disconnect principle, the more that we will make the world a better place. I mean, you will get along better with other people, but we will make the world a better place by spreading that message.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Anne, for being on my show today.
Thank you. It's been good talking to you.